Thank you everyone for coming over and attending this webinar. Thank you for taking time. I know it may be too early in some part of the world. It's late in the afternoon. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Today's topic is about scaling Scrum patterns. I'm going to talk about a few patterns in Scrum, and then we're going to look at some of the scaling aspects as well. So as everybody know, my name is Mohammed Rowther. I've been in the IT industry for about 20 years. I've worked in Agile projects. I've done a lot of transformation. I'm also a Scrum Scale trainer, and I'm an SPC candidate now. So I'm kind of getting going through the whole process. So if you have any questions about different scaling frameworks, feel free to ask any questions you want. I'm also a keynote speaker in some of the global gatherings. I do a lot of posts on LinkedIn. Please keep in touch. Have a look at LinkedIn. You can get a lot of information about Scrum and scaling Scrum. Everybody knows that Scrum is being used everywhere, right? So I have this latest statistics that was provided by Elusive Agile Enterprise, and it's noted that 77% of leading organizations, they use Scrum. What is the main reason for that? The main reason is faster time to market and faster innovation. So that's one of the major reasons why most of the organizations try and adapt to the working principle of Scrum. But it's just not about using the rule book. It's also about how your environment behaves when you start implementing Scrum. So it's how you play the game. So as Alistair Cockwell, he mentions, that describes that software development as a cooperative game. Scrum provides one set of rules for one such way of playing the game. So it's all about how you actually apply that rule book in your environment. That's the key thing. And then look at what your context is all about. So if you look at this, if you know about cricket, so the spirit of cricket or the spirit of the game, if you look at the way you implement Scrum in any areas, it's all about how you play the game. It could be football, it could be rugby, it could be anything. So the written rules might give you some sort of guidance. It could give you a list of to-do list. It may say you have to do this. It's got a few rules, rule 1, rule 2, maybe a few rules that actually allows you to implement those things. But what exactly do you learn from it? How do you implement those things? That's important in your environment. So the elements of the Scrum framework that we describe, they call as patterns. Now, the spirit is part of the culture of the organization. So we talk about culture being the biggest challenge in most areas. So when you implement Agile, or if you're trying to implement Scrum, the first and the biggest challenge is culture and the resistance to change. So look at the patterns. When we look at patterns, every element of Scrum framework is described in patterns. And what are these patterns? The patterns are nothing but repeatable, applicable solution to a problem that arises in a specific context. Now, in our work environment, when we have a problem, we try and fix it. We try some solution and see if that works in that situation. Now, if it does work, then we keep using that same solution. We start using it, but what else do? We start moving into the next challenge. So we have found a kind of a pattern that allows you to gives you the ability for that problem, gives you the solution for that problem. And if you're not able to resolve it, if you have not been able to achieve what you want to do, then we go back and see if something else works. So it's almost you're trying to be more agile, right? It sounds like we are kind of, when we apply these patterns, we are kind of being agile. So the rule book, that is your Scrum guide, provides you the rules, but when you start playing that within your organization, that's when you start realizing what are the problems and how can I get the solution. And that's when the continuous improvements takes place. Now, there are a lot of patterns like non-interrupts, there's Scrum of Scrums, there's Convoy's law, there's autonomous team, co-located teams. So every area of Scrum was well defined, and we call them as patterns. Now, each of these patterns, they help you focus and allow you to look at a single kind of a problem based on your context. Now, working in small steps is what we need, because when you work in small steps, that's when you can reduce the risk and helps the teams to move forward and gives the confidence in terms of improving the process. That's where we look at Kaizen. So a process improvement, continuous improvement, change for the better. So each pattern describes the solution in detail. So it gives you enough time to work through those patterns, to understand how the pattern can be applied in your environment, and then come up with a solution. And then you can, and that's when you realize that, oh, this is the kind of problem I face, and this is the solution I can try and apply to it. Now, when you look at the Scrum patterns, there's a book called the Scrum book. It divides these patterns into different sequences. It talks about the product organization sequence. It talks about the value stream sequence. Then you've got the product backlog, and then we have the scaling sequence. So in this webinar, I'm going to concentrate more on the scaling sequence. So I won't be going into detail about product and value stream. It'll be purely about scaling. And if time permits, we will talk a little bit about how scaling sequence has been applied within Scrum of Scrums, within the Scrum at scale. Now, no patterns are standalone. So if you look at the list of patterns we have, you can, it's easy. You feel tempted to actually cherry pick those patterns and try to apply to solve the problems in isolation. That's what you try and do. But sometimes what happens is you might have to, when you start working on some of the problems, you may end up having different issues that's coming up within the organization. That's what we look at. So a complex system for us is the workplace organization. So when we make a change, when we start implementing something in one place, we may have some issues that's been affecting other areas. Though each of these patterns help us focus on the problem, as I mentioned, the context is everything. Observe the context and apply the pattern that actually helps you. So you could have both the positive side of it and the negative side of it. The results could be anything, but it depends on how you apply these patterns across your context and your area. This is the most commonly used pattern. So most of you would have heard about this. It's called the swarming pattern. Now, if you look at the board, you can find an issue with that board on the left-hand side. You can see that most of the items are in progress. They're all checked out. Those cards are being actioned by the team, but everybody's working on different stories, the different tasks, and no one's actually working collaboratively. You can see that there's a lot of individual collaboration that's happening, individual contribution that's happening, but not a group contribution. Now, looking at this, the team may not achieve the sprint goal. So when we talk about a pattern called swarming, the first thing is you have to work on achieving the sprint goal. That's important. So what does your sprint goal talk about? What is your objective? What should we achieve? As a team, work towards that goal. Try and work on the cards, work on the stories that can deliver the sprint goal. That's important. That's what we see here. So when you have a development team or developers or testers working individually, then it becomes less efficient. So this application of pattern called swarming is all about getting the team to collaborate and work together in a group and achieve the sprint goal. Looking at the history of Scrum patterns, there's a link that I'll probably share towards the end. It's called the scrumbook.org, and if you Google, you'll get a website called Scrumplop, where you can find the history of Scrum patterns from where it started. So it all started about categorizing them into core Scrum, okay in Scrum, and not okay in Scrum, and then they looked at different areas, different pattern language that can actually be applied within an organization. Now the Scrum guide, as I mentioned, it doesn't tell you the rationale behind the Scrum as a whole. Yeah, so we don't know exactly this regarding the successful practices. It doesn't explain about all those things. How do we get to know about these things? It's only from the founders and the inventors who've done it. So the Scrumplop's mission was to build a body of pattern literature around these communities. So they wanted to build a blog that describes all the insights and also shares experiences about what's happening in the real world scenario. And this has been widely distributed across the Agile communities. I would recommend you to look at the website and also have a look at this book called A Scrum Book, The Spirit of the Game, written by Jeff Sutherland and James O'Coplin. It talks about all the patterns within Scrum and scaling environment. So looking at the statement provided by Dr. Jeff Sutherland, while the Scrum Guide describes the basic rules of Scrum, the patterns, they start amplifying the guide by showing teams how to solve problems in a specific context. So in Scrum, we identify the issue, we try and brainstorm, and then we try and resolve it. We try and engage the entire community. We engage with other areas of workplace, try to understand how they have resolved issues. So that's what we do. And the patterns gives us the guide to apply a solution for your problems. Now these patterns, they also shape the on-job training. So what exactly do you do in your workplace, and making Scrum to work for you? That's the key thing. One of the I want to explain about Fred Brooks, who mentioned in his book, adding people to a late project makes it later, and that's very true. So adding people to a late project makes it later. So what happens? So if you are going to add about 6 people, 6%, if a 6-person team takes about 11 months to do something, and if you start adding more and more people, so for example, let's add 10 more people to it, it's going to take you about 15 or 17 months. So the same phenomenon occurs at the team level. So adding teams it reduces your productivity per team. That's the whole idea from Fred Brooks. And also the communication overhead, it starts exploding, it starts moving across when you start adding more people. And this will actually reduce the productivity per person within your team. Now, how do we overcome these things? Because scaling requires you to build more teams, have more network of teams, and scale across the organization. Using patterns, you can actually overcome Brooks' law. And this book clearly explains one of the patterns called the scaling patterns. Talks about Scrum of Scrums, which I'm going to talk about in detail. And from this pattern is where Scrum at Scale was kind of created. I want to do a quick question time. We discussed a few things in the last few slides. What pattern talks about group contribution? So you've got 3 questions there, A, B, and C. You've got stable teams, you've got small teams, you've got swarming. Now, you can post your answers using the link that I mentioned there. It's the https span.neurova.com/qs. Use a code, post your answers, and I'm also going to do a kind of I'm going to give a prize towards the end of today. So you can add your email address as well, and I'm going to do like a lucky draw and send this book. It's called the Scrum book to one of the winners. So take your time, try and answer this question. You have time till the end of today. Capture the link, send your answers, A, B, or C. And if you want to enter the lucky dip, please enter your email address, and I will choose. We will do that later in the evening, and I will send this book across to the winner. A Scrum book, Spirit of the Game. If you're keen to get this book, please get into this session. So take your time, answer the question. I'm going to give about 10 to 20 seconds. All you have to do is launch this on a browser. It could be your device, it could be your browser on your desktop, and all you get is a notepad, kind of a sticky note on your screen. Type in the answer, and if you want to participate in the lucky dip, please enter your email address, and I will and I'll by the end of today I'll send the winners list. Great. Okay, so looking at scaling, so we've got the pattern called mitosis it's a scaling pattern. Now, we often see Scrum teams with a desire to scale. That's what we do. That's what's been happening in the last few years as the product services have been increasing in an organization. Where you had single Scrum, they started increasing the number of Scrum teams. They started getting more and more forming more and more Scrum teams, but then the productivity, the output, everything started dropping because of cross-team dependencies, because of cross-team issues, and all these things. But looking at the pattern, a scaling pattern, what does this actually talk about? So when you scale, you have to scale without losing productivity. And that's what we call as linear scalability. It requires a fractal-like design. So every component or every network of team that you actually start building, they look alike, but they have different functionalities to perform. So you have to build small teams with all these object-oriented information, and this will actually reduce the communication paths. So you don't want thousands of people gathering together, thousands of people working and talking to each other. You want to reduce that communication path. You want to build those stable interfaces in between that enhances the communication. Now, within this network, there's a lot of transparency, and everyone knows what is the common goal that we're going to achieve. That's the key thing. The vision translates into a common goal, and that's what this network of team would be working towards. So when you start scaling, you have to ensure that you scale without losing productivity. So as I start increasing the number of teams, my delivery mechanism also increases, and they are stable. They are directly proportional. So for that, we have to self-organize at scale. That's important. So one should grow a Scrum team in an incremental fashion, but eventually the team just becomes too large to remain efficient. That's what we see here. We don't know who's working on what. That becomes complicated, and that becomes, it's just unstable. So you are in a state of losing productivity. You're in a state of not meeting the market needs. You're in the state of not delivering your product on time. So what should you do? Try and build small cross-functional teams. So you could distribute this large team into two cross-functional teams, and they can start working together and collaborating together. And when they catch up, they can perform their events to share what's going on. What happens within what are the dependencies, what takes place within their area of work, what information can be shared. And that's when you start scaling your events. You start performing your scale daily Scrum, you start performing your scale sprint planning, and all these factors. Now, the pattern, Scrum of Scrums. When multiple teams start working independently of each other, they tend to focus kind of myopically on their own concerns, yeah, and they lose sight of the common goals. So this is not great. So when you are not aligned, when you are not focused on your common goals, it becomes a serious issue. You will not be able to achieve what your organization requires or what's been set as an objective. You lose focus in your sprint goal, you lose focus on what is the vision. So you have to work on the right and the responsibility to collaborate on delivering common goals. That's important. And that is identified by the product owner, and the development team gathers all that information. That's important. There should be a flow of information, and that is transparency from the product owner team to the development areas. Now, what exactly do we expect here? What do we need? In the real world, what do we do? So we have to sprint together. So we have to have follow the same cadence. That's 2-week sprint. Get your multiple teams to work on the similar kind of cadence. Not having one team work at one week sprint and the other team working on 3-week sprints. No, let there be a common synchronization. You have to sprint together, and then you maintain a common definition of done. Have a well-defined definition of done. So you have your common sprint planning, your sprint reviews, and any kind of mandatory Scrum events. And one of the most essential things about refining your backlog. So get those events in common, try to collaborate the teams, and try and get a solid foundation when you do this refinement session. Only this way you can actually start optimizing your network. Otherwise, it's going to collapse. It's not going to sustain. So establishing a regular Scrum of Scrum events, and also try and get things done. That's important. So your release, your Scrum of Scrums team works together to release an increment. That's important. Now I spoke about alignment. Successful alignment requires that everyone involved in the team, everybody, has a visibility of what needs to be done. The vision, that's the key. And the vision is your goal. You can call it as a goal, a mission, or your common goals that you actually look at it. So when you start scaling, you have to look at how things are collaborative, how the development teams collaborate with each other and work towards those things. Now, Scrum of Scrums is nothing but a set of teams. In most areas, what everybody understands Scrum of Scrums is an event, but in Scrum at Scale, Scrum of Scrums is a set of teams. They work together to deliver a product increment at the end of the sprint. The event that takes place is called the Scale Daily Scrum. Now, this is an official event that happens, and it's facilitated by the Scrum of Scrums Master. The Scrum of Scrums Master is the one who facilitates this. And it's time box. It's also 15 minutes. The SDS mirrors the daily Scrum. It's an opportunity for all the other teams to start talking about the cross dependencies, the issues, the impediments, and also shared learning. It could be about what have I done better? What is a new process I've implemented? Any new code coverage? So you can talk about process improvements and also about Kaizen. What can we do to help support each other? That's important. That's the whole purpose of this SDS, Scale Daily Scrum. Looking at another pattern, the product owner team is also a pattern. So the product owner has it's like a team. So you have more than one member, and it's led by a chief product owner. So whose members, they carry out what the product ownership needs to be done. What are the areas they need to work on? So they have the vision. They start working on a backlog. They start refining it, and look at how the backlog can be prioritized. So all activities. So it all starts from the vision. But if you look at a pattern called MetaScrum, and let's look at the way the traditional model was all about. Now you had the management who were kind of interfering, and they were trying to directly talk to the Scrum teams and control the product kind of implementation and the direction. So this actually is a big problem. So the product owners who's sitting here are kind of, they are just puppets. They don't do much. So the management interference, and they start working with sharing that information with multiple teams, and then there's a lot of redundant work that takes place. So to actually manage this, the MetaScrum is what we want to implement. It's like a forum. You create a MetaScrum where the entire enterprise can align behind the product owner's backlog. That's key at every level of Scrum. So this is an event that can be applied at every level of Scrum. So if you start scaling and if you start moving up to the entire enterprise, your MetaScrum event keeps things aligned. This is an example of how the product owner can be scaled. So you've got a team with a dedicated product owner. As you start moving up, you have the executive MetaScrum, and you also have a CPO, that is a chief product owner, at the SOS level. Now, what does the executive MetaScrum do? It's nothing but a group of dynamic leaders. They set the organizational vision and the strategic priorities. Now, this is quite important. The vision and the strategic priorities, they play a very important role. And that's where you start aligning all your teams to achieve that sprint goal, to achieve that common goal. They all work. So you have a single team at the sprint level, then you have a multiple set of teams at the scrum of scrums level, and then you have the entire organization working towards the common goal. Now, this all the teams here are pure scrum teams. Even the group of leaders, they operate like the scrum teams. They have this catch up, they do the stand ups, they start looking at the impediments, and start removing those things. Now, this is at the product owner side of it. Now, let's look at what an executive action team does in Scrum at scale. So you've got this engineering goals, you've got the process goals, and you've got the business goals. Now, all this can be achieved only when you form a proper Scrum team and have enough support from the leadership. So you have your product owner, you have your Scrum master, and you have your development team who start working towards these goals. So you cannot achieve this goal without having a proper vision. That's the key thing. So they start working, this team starts working on all the strategies that was set up by the product owner organization. So you have a team that sets your strategy and the other team that actually executes the strategy. So if you start looking at it as a whole, so you have, this is an example of 125 teams in 5 value streams. So we call each one as a value stream. The EAT is the executive action team. As the name suggests, they start eating impediments. They start eating your blockers. They start resolving them. Now, when does the impediments travel to this layer? So if your Scrum team is not able to resolve the issue, it goes to the Scrum of Scrums, and then if that Scrum of Scrums network teams is not able to resolve those things, it moves up. It starts going to the executive action team. That's their final stop for removing the impediments. There's nothing beyond that, and all this happens within a span of few hours, and that's the beauty of the way it's structured. So the events that they do is similar to Scrum teams. They look at the executive action team catch up on a daily basis. Look at daily Scrum. It's optional for them to try and gather between 1 or 2 days, or maybe once a week, and they are also supported by a team called Agile Practice Team, where they focus on building this Agile ecosystem within the organization. Why do we want to build this Agile ecosystem? Because we want to do a complete transformation in the organization. So we want to get every area to move into Agile and Scrum. So this Agile practice team works with the EAT, and they start looking at what is the quality of Scrum, what are the different areas that's been working, and start assessing the model and help the Scrum masters and product owners. They start coaching them, they start training them, they do all the aspects, just like how you have a center of excellence in most of the organization. So you've got the Agile practice team here. Now, looking at the framework, Scrum Scale framework, I spoke to you about the product owner side of it and the Scrum Master cycle. They all coordinate to work with each other. You can look at the how and the what, and you've got the leadership teams sitting in between, the executive action team and the executive MetaScrum team. So the entire cycle is accountable for the what, that's what the product that you're building, and how, the process that you're actually performing. Now, any scaling requires you to have leadership support. That's the basis as well. So you are doing Scrum, but you need to have leadership support. You need to get the buy-in from the management. That's important. Now, why should I use Scrum at Scale? What are the reasons? Now, Scrum at Scale creates this entire Agile ecosystem. So you start with the reference model, and once you start removing some of the organizational impediments, you can start scaling that across to different network of teams. You can start multiplying that. So you build a prototype, and the prototype becomes a big example for you to start scaling, start moving across. Now it's a scale-free architecture. You can have as many network of teams you want, and they will grow organically. The whole thing is the pattern that is being applied enables you to grow organically. And we also spoke about the linear scalability. So as you increase the number of teams, the network of teams, if you start increasing them, it doesn't break. Just like what you see in the chip design within Intel. And if you look at some of the DNA chromosomes within our area, within our body, they are all scale-free architecture. The internet is a scale-free architecture. The internet never breaks, even if you had more people coming into it. So, and then Scrum Scale uses the basic principles of Scrum and Lean. So it talks about removing impediments. It talks about alignment. It gets you to work on different patterns so that you can build hyper-productive teams. It's a non-prescriptive framework. That's quite interesting. So what is your context like? What does it look like? That's important. So you observe, you assess your context, you look at your culture, and try and work on the components that needs to be improvised. It's a value-driven culture. It talks about all the three pillars and the values of Scrum. And that is sufficient for you to actually build a healthy and a smart organization. Now, with leadership support, we talk about minimal viable bureaucracy. This is what Scrum at Scale provides, a minimal viable bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy is existing in most of the organization. So you have hierarchical system. When you look at things that are being when you try and resolve an impediment, how long does it take? It takes ages sometimes when you have this hierarchical system. A Scrum team raises an impediment, and then that takes ages by the time it gets resolved, and by the time the team gets it, they tend to forget that they've raised an impediment. So this actually slows down the team. Your leadership team should support you in actually resolving those impediments. So a success of a project depends on how soon a decision latency happens. It is a time to make a decision within a stipulated amount of time. Otherwise, your project is going to fail. So if you have a good decision latency, we're looking at like less than a few hours. And if it's taking weeks, months, or if it's going beyond 5 hours, it is a poor decision latency. You are being blocked. Your team is being blocked, and you can't deliver your items into the market. It's going to be really difficult for you to sustain within the environment. So as you scale in large organization, depending upon the size of your organization, start moving from one Scrum team to a Scrum of Scrums. You could have 4 or 5 Scrum teams. Now, within this network, it's advisable to have 5 Scrum teams or less. This is from research from Harvard Review. The optimal size is 4.6. And keep your Scrum of Scrums team 5 or less. So you could start with 2, 3, 4, or 5. That should be good enough. And then you start building different network of teams. So you could start expanding Scrum of Scrums with 5 teams, and then start building another layer, Scrum of Scrums. You have different value streams. And as you expand, you could start looking at having multiple value streams with 125 teams. And this is an example of how you could have a combination. So you could have 5 Scrum of Scrums with 2, 3, 4, or 5 teams. Now, the scaling the Scrum of Scrums reduces the number of communication pathways. That's important because we are creating stable interfaces in between. You don't want everybody to interact with each other. You have the stable interfaces that talk to each other and share all the information. This is where the complexity of communication overhead is limited. So minimal viable bureaucracy overcomes Brooks' law and will help you achieve linear scalability. This is where we want to go. We want to move up. And that can be achieved with minimal viable bureaucracy. Scrum at Scale offers you this. And that's when you start reducing the agile transformation failure while delivering twice the value in half the time. And that's the secret of the future and survival of your company. Now, if you were to take the Scrum at Scale certification, what could you do? What kind of a area you could work? You could work as a Scrum Master. You could work as a Scrum of Scrums Master within the network of teams. You could work as a product owner, the chief product owner. And if you've got more experience, if you're part of the leadership, you could be an agile transformation leader or a practice lead and be one of the change agents. You could implement Scrum at Scale in different organizations, where you can facilitate cross-team collaboration and release planning with tens and thousands of teams. There's no limitation. You could help in creating and transforming transformation backlog and building transformation strategies, building the transformation execution backlog. So that that's going to help you to build this scaling framework. There's a lot of metrics that's provided within Scrum at Scale that allows you to measure productivity, sustainability, quality, value delivery. So all these aspects are provided. And then you also create a heat map, which is like an assessment model for your organization, and you can start scaling using that as a backlog. Scrum at Scale provides a list of case studies in their library. So if you go to scrumscale.com, you can have a look at case studies provided by Spotify, Toyota, IDX. IDX is now called GE. You've got Saab, and then you've got Amazon's, and you've got multinational banking. You've got different areas. So I would recommend you to visit scrumscale.com. Have a look at the case studies. You can see how Scrum at Scale has been implemented across different organizations, different areas. So what is covered in the 2-day course? So as I mentioned, we build a scaling map. Over the 2 days, we build a scaling map. We start assessing each area of focus within the Scrum at Scale framework. We evaluate that, and then you can take that back to your organization and start implementing and start looking at the areas that you want to focus on. Now, Scrum at Scale is a joint venture between Scrum Alliance and Scrum Inc. So you get your education units. You can start raising those points at the Scrum Alliance website. Now, what do I cover? We cover the basics of Scrum, some of the core competencies. I work through the patterns. I look at the patterns. I explain the patterns applied within Scrum and scaling Scrum. We learn about the what and the why of Scrum at Scale. Why Scrum at Scale should be used. What are the differences between Scrum at Scale and other frameworks? And we try and understand both the cycles, the Scrum Master cycle and the Product Owner cycle. We try and understand how they coordinate with each other and deliver a complete product. At the end of the 2 days, you have a test, and you can take the test at the end of the you get over 1 month time, or if you want to do the test towards the end of the class, you can do that, and a certificate is generated where you are certified as a Scrum at Scale practitioner.